Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll be starting here in just about 2 minutes. All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Top 5 Things All Schools Can Do Quickly to Help Improve Their Cybersecurity Posture. This is a webinar put forward by the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and a happy Thursday before Halloween to everybody. We're going to unveil our top 5 right off the bat, get that right out of the way. So the top 5 things we're going to be talking about today is training and awareness, risk assessment and mitigation, information sharing and collaboration, standardization and processes, and incident response and planning. And don't worry about writing those down. We'll post this on our DPI website here in about a week after we get a closed caption. We'll put all this up there for you, along with any resources that are brought up during our discussion today. So let's get started. First of all, my name is Ed Snow, and I am the Assistant Director at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction on the technology team. And with me today, I'm really excited. I have one of my good friends from the Washington, D.C. area working for PTech. I have Mike Tassi with us today. And Mike has been in the industry for about 20 years, and he really knows his stuff. And we're super blessed to have him here. So, Mike, you want to just take a minute and kind of introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure, and thank you, Ed, for the invitation to be here today. I'm also very excited to have an opportunity to talk to you and to all the folks that join us about data security and privacy on this wonderful Cybersecurity Awareness Month. As Ed mentioned, I'm with the Privacy Technical Assistance Center at the U.S. Department of Education. I'm the data security advisor, and I have a sort of a history prior to coming to education that's a little different than most. Prior to coming to Ed, I spent most of my time working as either a penetration tester or a security consultant. So I have sort of an adversarial view when it comes to systems in general, which hopefully we'll be able to talk through some of these great 5 things that Ed mentioned, and I can add some context to why they're important and ways that schools and educators in general can leverage these things to make yourself harder targets. So thrilled to be here and looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, and we're super excited to have you here. And I know the state of Wisconsin is going to benefit from this, and maybe the others around the world too. So I appreciate your time. Today's session is going to be, we're not going to use a slide deck or any kind of a PowerPoint. It's going to be really conversation based, almost podcast style. It's because we recognize that you're out there and you've seen enough webinars for one lifetime this year in 2020. So we're going to make it very conversation based. So I invite you to, throw your headphones on, maybe check your emails, do some work, and listen to our discussion as we go along. Should be a lot of fun, and looking forward to it. So let's go ahead and jump right into our first topic and our first top 5. And earlier in the month with Amelia Vance and Dr. Annette Smith, we had a good discussion around, creating a culture of cybersecurity and data privacy in your community and in your school district. And so that kind of leads us right into our first bullet point. One of the first things we can do is, provide training and awareness for the people that are going to be, anybody who has an email account, basically, anybody who's touching that data. And so, Mike, I'm going to volley on over to you and have you expand on that a little bit.
Well, thanks, Ed, and you hit it right on the head. The culture of security is kind of key to this, right? So traditionally, schools are in the business of educating kids, and so a lot of times it's easier to focus on the giant stack of things that you have to worry about as a teacher or as an administrator, or staff member at a school or a district. That piling on this idea of being responsible for security as well is overwhelming. It's don't worry, we have an IT department for that. And really that's kind of what we're getting at the culture of security is changing that mindset and getting teachers and administrators and staff members, people who aren't affiliated with just strictly in the IT world, to take some ownership of data security and realize that that all of us in the ecosystem have a responsibility, a role to play in keeping this critical data safe. And so there's a couple of pieces to this, which are I think are really kind of foundational, and they sound very easy, but of course, sometimes there's hiccups. There's momentum, resistance to change sometimes, and so part of that is that first point around training awareness, which is that this has to be driven from the top, right? It's that old adage that if the boss doesn't care, nobody cares, and so leadership. Getting leadership behind the message that this data security problem that we have in schools, this ongoing sort of incidences of ransomware and this sort of thing, aren't just technology problems. They involve the folks as well. There are social engineering aspects of this, and so getting leadership to buy in and say, you know what, this is a priority in our organization. And driving that sort of cultural adoption of security as a foundational principle is super important.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think one of the analogies I love to use, and we used in the last session, is that think of all the effort that goes into a field trip or playground time to make sure the student is safe. When we would take the same approach, or we need to take the same approach when we're looking at data privacy and data security. We need to, kind of do all the little things to make sure that everyone's safe when they're out there. And I really appreciate you calling out that leadership. It goes so much more efficient when a superintendent or a business director, is helping lead that charge and creating some importance to it.
Absolutely, and one of the follow-on to the leadership, of course, is that folks need to know what to do, right? There needs to be this kind of, not only do they need to know that it's important, but we need to empower teachers and staff members and administrators with the tools to understand the threats. And that key second point around this is building an annual training, a cybersecurity or data security awareness training that can kind of help people who are out there who maybe aren't involved in the IT world and don't get exposed to some of those threats, to understand how those threats sort of appear, and to reinforce those mechanisms that we have, so that if something goes bump in the night, if they get a strange email, or if their computer does something they're not used to, that they know who to call, and they realize that there's no stigma attached to this, and it's better for everybody if we're all involved in security. So another an excellent follow-on is that leadership buy-in is great, but if the people don't know what to do, then you kind of run into the same problem. So having that annual training program is another key point around that. That's very important.
Yeah, and thanks for calling that out. In my role, that's one of the things I help provide for the agency. And surprisingly enough, we actually have staff members that reach out to me and say, I feel a little bit inadequate. Is there additional training? So I think it's important to also realize that, while it's hard to carve that time out in a K-12, and it's always that one more thing, that training, that I think, teachers and administrators and everybody who works in K-12, they want to make sure the kids' data is safe, and they really do want to make sure everything's okay. So they're not always opposed to it. They're willing to take on that training.
Yeah, and one thing I have learned in my time in education is that folks who go into education they care about kids, And we tend to think, in terms of the safety of the kids in our schools. We think of physical threats, and we think of all of these things that could possibly happen, and we go out of our way to make ourselves vigilant and aware of these many threats. But I think the one that has kind of fallen through the cracks in some cases is the cyber threat, the threat to the data, right? Because that's what these cyber criminals are after, is that critical data for a variety of purposes. But as educators, the folks, they're thirsty for that knowledge. How do we keep kids safe in our schools? And I think the cyber aspect of it is really important.
Yeah, great. I think that's an excellent first point. I think that's always starting with why is always a really good place to go in helping everyone understand. Let's pivot over now to risk mitigation and risk assessment and mitigation. So, now we've kind of created this culture, and we've got everybody, bought in and ready to help out and do their part and, contribute to making sure everything's good. But how do we make sure that we're doing all the good things on the back end and make sure that we're, prepared and, all set to go?
So absolutely. I think the key there is that old adage of know yourself and know your enemy, and you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Our old friend Sun Tzu said it so many centuries ago. That I'm a CISSP, so I have to add Sun Tzu references obligatory in all of my talks. But understanding that your weaknesses as an organization and what threats you're faced with is that key piece to understanding the risk that you face, the risk to your data and to your organization. So kind of assessing that risk, doing that risk assessment, getting an understanding of what the threat is, and really kind of your own sort of posture around cybersecurity can help to do that. And there's a bunch of resources that, because I have yet to find a school that is not challenged somewhat in their, their ability to expend resources on cybersecurity. There are a ton of resources out there, not only at the SPPO and PTAC websites at the Department of Ed, but also through the Department of Homeland Security, the NCATS program, and other such programs, and a lot of industry partners out there that have provided a bunch of free resources and tools and sometimes services that schools can use to kind of get that view of what they look like externally to an attacker, and also to kind of address some of those things that they find and understand what that means to their infrastructure.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. And for those of you who are watching right now, or watching in at a later time in the future, hello to the future, we'll be sure to list any of the resources that we talk about here today. MS ISAC comes to mind, PTAC is great, Department of Ed, all those are pretty much on our DPI website right now. But if we find any new ones, or if Mike uncovers any new ones, I'm sure I'll be glad to put those up so that all the state of Wisconsin can share those. I also like to kind of, thinking about risk assessment and mitigation, I like to think about that almost in a post environment. Like, if the bad thing were to happen, have I done everything that I could have done? So am I prepared? If I'm going to stand there as a tech director or a superintendent in front of the school board and the community and explain what happened, have I done everything to be prepared to make sure that data is safe? And I think, Mike, one thing that I think we need to call out here is there's a likelihood you're not going to get everything done. And there's a likelihood that, you may do everything just right, but you still may fail, and somebody still may get to some of that data. But it's important that you make that effort anyway. You want to just unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure, Ed. And I think what you're getting to there is what I like to refer to as risk math, right? It's threat times your vulnerability equals your risk. With the idea there being that if you're invulnerable to attack, in other words, there's no vulnerability in your environment, you don't have to care about threats, because the result is no one can get in. Of course, the inverse is true. If you have all the vulnerabilities in the world but nobody wants your data, then obviously there's no risk. And we know that is never the case, right? That this is not a zero-sum game. There's never no risk. But what that sort of traditional aspect, I think, fails to take into consideration is the consequences, right? Because not all risks have the same outcome for an organization. And so it's not just about understanding this, list of threats and a list of vulnerabilities, but it's understanding what happens if that vulnerability is exploited. Let's say it's the impacts of your smart toaster in the faculty break room being hacked versus the impact of the school's heating and air conditioning system. Those two may have drastically different impacts on your organization. And so when organizations like schools who have limited resources to spend on cybersecurity, understanding the nuance of what those threats mean in terms of impact is really helpful when you're guiding those limited resources to where they will make the most impact, right? So understanding that, I think, is hugely important.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you there. And let's just take a moment and talk about risk in the environment that we live in now in 2020 and COVID. It was pretty safe to say maybe 5, maybe 10 years ago, K-12s, universities, a lot of their security was what I would like to call security through obscurity, that basically nobody cared about the data, and that it was, nobody really went after K-12s. But can you just talk about what's happening right now specifically and kind of how that's kind of flipping around a little bit?
Sure. And the map has completely changed. Like you mentioned, in the last few years, attackers go after where their data lives, right? The attackers are after data. And so suddenly, as schools have started to collect and use and share and communicate more data, they've sort of elevated themselves in the view of attackers. And so where in the past the vast majority of information in a school would have been in some government beige filing cabinet in the administration office, today they're in big data systems. They're stored in cloud providers' infrastructures. They're being shared amongst a variety of educational agencies and sometimes third parties, and so the exposure is very high. And as schools have become victims increasingly of, for example, the Maze ransomware that's sort of targeting schools here recently, there's been an awakening on the part of the attackers where they realize, hey, schools have a lot of sensitive data and they're willing to pay. And so they're targeting schools. And so our obscurity has kind of been stripped away, and we've been exposed as being viable targets for these folks.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that kind of calls right back to our first point about why it's everyone's lift and why we need everyone involved, because, quite honestly, that's how they're going to get in. It's I think 65, 70% of most compromises happen because somebody made an oopsie, which is a professional term, and you can coin that if you want, a professional oopsie. So let's talk a little bit about collaboration. So we've talked a little bit about creating your culture, and we've talked a little bit about what the risk assessment and threat is, and that seems like a lot of, like, we're stacking the hill pretty high here, but there's things we can do together through collaboration and sharing information to kind of help make that hill a little less steep. Mike?
Absolutely, and you mentioned a couple of great resources. The information sharing and analysis centers like MSISAC is a great example of that. None of us are as smart as all of us, and nobody has time. We're education. We're schools. We're not the NSA. We're not a computer security firm. Our goal is to educate kids. So if all of us gather our information and we share threat information and we exchange that information in a way that the community can ingest, then we're going to be much more successful in preparing ourselves for what's going on in the cyber world. And that could come in a variety of forms. The ISACs, of course, the Department of Ed has some resources. PTAC, I can't plug PTAC enough, but we have some great resources, and we know of a lot of folks in the community that if you have a question or you've seen something, you can always ask us, and we can point you in a direction if we know. Of course, there's tons of vendor repositories of information. So if you have those third-party partnerships, talking with them about what they're seeing is also a good way to get sort of that baseline of information. But I think probably the most valuable is when you partner with your peer organizations, when districts and schools communicate and share information about what they're seeing regionally, that's the most likely to affect them. And so there's a big value there.
Yeah, I can't echo that enough. Here in Wisconsin, the maize, thing was happening, and you could see a clear path that they were going on a channel, and basically hitting one community and assuming that the next community had the same protocols and policies and procedures in place, and often, unfortunately, being successful. So the way to thwart that is to share that information with your neighbor and say, hey, heads up, this happened to us, or watch out for this. Just kind of like a good neighborhood watch program. Everybody kind of looking out for each other. Can you just take a minute and maybe explain to our listeners what PTAC is and what it is you folks do, and why you exist?
Sure. Well, the PTAC is the Privacy Technical Assistance Center, and we're part of the Student Privacy Policy Office at the Department of Ed. We've recently undergone a name change, but we are a group that is sort of a one-stop shop for all things student data privacy and security related. So our goal is to interface with the field and provide schools and districts and then post-secondary and state and local education agencies with any assistance that they need with regard to student privacy and data security. And so we provide a ton of online training. We do a lot of resources. We link to some important data security best practices, and we've created a whole list of resources on our website at studentprivacy.ed.gov that folks can get access to. And of course, we do things like this, and we have great conversations with our partners in the field about student privacy and data security.
Yeah, and PTAC and MSISAC and a bunch of Department of Ed are all listed on the DPI website. So I would encourage our listeners to go ahead and, when you have time, when you have a few minutes, take a venture over there and follow that link. And I would highly recommend signing up for some Department of Ed's newsletters. These are great ways to kind of keep a pulse on what's happening. They're really good about, like, hey, you need to think about this. This one's pretty important. So calling those out and getting you in front of something that might be, bad for you. And I will also shout out for PTAC. Every time that I've sent they have a basic customer question email. Every time I've used that form, I get a response in the same day. Super responsive. And that goes back to the times when I was K-12 and just getting started. They're really, really good. So I highly recommend you take time to put them on your bookmark list and make sure that you spend a little time there, every month. So let's flip on over to procedures. So another one of the top 5 things that we can do to help get our schools, districts ready is kind of, I like to think of it as getting organized. It is certainly, if you've ever been in the middle of a data breach or a cyber event, it can be as chaos as if there was a flood or a fire or a tornado, because maybe you don't know how to respond to it. So taking some time to standardize and have your processes in place is super important. And Mike, if you'd like to just kind of talk about that a little bit, like some of the things you should do in that process.
Sure, and you bring up a great point there, Ed. This is when we're talking about standardization, what we're talking about is trying to make your lives easier in the case that something goes wrong, right? Schools can be chaotic places at a baseline, and so understanding what data you have and where that data is can help you direct those resources to protect it. Having standards in terms of what do we allow to be installed on our computers? What applications are we using, right? What ports are open on our firewalls? These are all kind of those foundational pieces of information that allow you to make important risk decisions. And so that standardization process allows you to have a more predictable environment. When something happens, I know this happened and this happened, and I can essentially take for granted that this existed. Right, so standardizing really does help you, understand your environment a little better, and better plan for where your resources are going to be pre-staged.
I agree, and I think in today's day and age, we're seeing a big shift from having data, on premises versus in the cloud, you've got basically two different environments. So understanding where that data lives, whether it be in the little closet in the high school where the server room is, or in the cloud somewhere, knowing where that data is and how it's getting transferred back and forth is super important. Let's talk a little bit about backups and why those could be super important, especially when we're looking at like ransomware.
Well, you hit on the key word there. The ransomware threat is the driving factor behind this kind of renewed interest in backups. They've always been a critical part of enterprise operations, but even more so now with this sort of epidemic of ransomware targeting schools, right? Ransomware, for those who haven't been through a ransomware attack, it encrypts all of the data on your systems, and many times this spreads to systems which contain critical data that you need for school operations, things that help you educate kids on a day-to-day basis. If your backups are not sufficient, or if your backups haven't been tested, right? It's not enough just to back up data, but also to test and see if they're viable in terms of being able to be restored. In the event of a ransomware attack, you may be forced into a situation where you have to pay the ransom and keep your fingers crossed that you will be able to retrieve your data. And unfortunately, in many situations, that has been impossible, and schools have been faced with that untenable situation of losing all of this critical data simply because they didn't have workable backups. So absolutely, Ed, you hit it right on the head. Backups are a key survival aspect for any school or district right now in terms of what's going on with ransomware.
Run them early, run them often, and make sure you test them every so often.
Indeed.
So, and then our next kind of a talking point around standardization and processes is really around keeping an inventory of software and hardware baselines. And I think this goes back to that culture piece that we started off with, and that's why we opened with that, is, especially during COVID, there's certainly a uptick in new software being used. And, Mike, why is that important that we know what's being used on our systems?
Well, for a couple of reasons. The first, obviously, is that you need to be aware of what vulnerabilities you have. And unfortunately, we have yet to achieve that panacea of bug-proof software. And so software inevitably requires a sort of a continuous process of updating and patching and that sort of thing. So if your IT department, for example, doesn't know that a particular application is in use, they don't know to patch that application. And so you can have situations where particular software has a vulnerability that you're unaware of. And over time, that vulnerability, exists without being patched. And someday, an attacker leverages an exploit against that application. The second part of, about that is also kind of understanding what's being used in the classroom as well, that the vetting apps angle of this. Especially around COVID, like you mentioned, people in the as necessitated by the current health emergency have run out and just grabbed tools to try to make it, to try to get through, to shift everything to this sort of remote learning paradigm for months on end, and that has led to the sort of leveraging software that wasn't necessarily designed for an educational context. And so understanding what that software does and how it works and how data that is used in those pieces of software is stored and exposed potentially is a huge thing.
Yeah, I think the most important word you used there, in my opinion, was the word vetting. Taking time to do something that nobody wants to do and read a terms of service agreement, right? The one thing that we are, I'm very, very apt to say to everybody is, if it's free, there's a reason it's free. Something is likely making somebody money, and it's probably the data. There's a huge market for selling data for a wide variety of reasons which we don't need to go into right now. But if a company is harvesting data, you need to make sure that they're using it properly and not going to share it for reasons that you can't control. So, all right, let's talk about, and we've talked about our four big ones here, but how do we get prepared? How are we, ready for the bad thing? Let's talk about incident planning and, how when something does happen that we can say, okay, we've got a plan for that.
Well, the unfortunate reality of today's world is that if you have not had a data breach or an incident that you've had to respond to in your organization, you probably will at some point. You can't count on not being in a situation like that, and in many cases, it's when you least expect it that you have to deal with these things. Like, for example, during a pandemic. So the last thing you want as an organization is for the first time you've thought about incident response is when you have an incident. And so that response process up front, building that plan and getting those resources stacked up and ready to respond in the case of an incident, saves you a lot of time, and it saves you a lot of heartbreak, and it really makes the overall experience, it's never a good one, but can make it less impactful to your organization, and perhaps stop the bleeding a little earlier, which is the goal.
Yeah, I think this goes back to what I commented on earlier. At some point, it's going to happen, and let's hope for all of you out there listening that it's a minor breach or a minor compromise. But at some point, someone's going to ask you, "What did you do to prepare?" And you want to be able to look them in the face and say, "We did a lot, and we did everything that we thought was necessary," versus saying, "Well, we weren't ready." So, because it is sensitive data. So let's just talk about communication a little bit. When an incident happens, is it a good idea, Mike, to just kind of like wait and see and keep that information, close to the vest, and then let the information out in little bits and pieces, or is it better to have a really good communication plan?
Well, it is absolutely imperative that you have a good communications plan, right? And there's a couple of reasons for that, because I've seen a lot of data breaches, unfortunately, in my time in education, and I've seen some examples of really good responses and some really bad ones. And the really bad ones were the result of sometimes saying too much before that incident had been truly validated. A great example of that, for example, is if you have a breach in your organization and it's a huge student database and there's 200,000 lines in this database, and you make this in an effort to be transparent, you say, hey, we had an incident, potentially 200,000 people involved, and then you find out that really it was only 5 people involved. Validating that event prior to making announcements is hugely important, because what you say and how you say it affects your organization's ability to respond. And it can potentially damage your relationship with the community. So understanding what the breach is, and understanding its extent is kind of key, right? Having that plan for having a single point of contact, for example, to release information, so you're not getting multiple stories, making sure that the facts are true and accurate to your knowledge, and to involve, obviously, your legal counsel in the process is hugely important, right? When that communications aspect, the technical stuff, when it comes to breach response, is pretty easy. The really sticky wicket is the communications aspect. And so you've hit on the kingpin of incident response planning, which is knowing how you're going to communicate that and having that structure set up so that information can flow, transparency can occur, but that information is correct and true.
I agree. And, one thing I like to tell school districts is, in the event of an incident or a breach, there's a likelihood that financially there's going to be an impact. You're going to lose, money at some level. But the more importantly is the trust. And money can be replaced. New items can be bought, but trust amongst your community is really hard to earn back. So having that communication plan in place really helps keep that trust going. So people are going to be less apt to be angry if they know that you tried and you communicated well, versus something bad happened and you didn't tell them about it. So really important to keep that trust factor up with your school districts. So Mike, I'm an old football coach. I coached football for 20 years, and I would never ever think about taking a football team into a game without any practice. How do we prepare for something like that? Is there, how do we have practice when it comes to cyber response?
Well, you're absolutely right. And so you want to huddle up before the event happens, right? You want to get together and get a playbook. So the first piece of that puzzle is to develop an incident response plan for your organization or your district, whatever it happens to be, and sort of pregame, right? Run through some scenarios. Tabletop exercises are something that I always recommend as a great way for an organization to test their plan, right? Come up with a scenario and sit around a table with all the folks that'll be part of your incident response planning or incident response process and go through that scenario. And many times you'll find the little bumps in the road and communications issues and well, this doesn't quite work for our organization. You'll find those in the process of running through these tabletops. So I always recommend it as a best practice that folks, in the organization, maybe you do it when you do your annual risk assessment. Sit around and come up with a scenario. It can be kind of gamified if you'd like. I always love to be the guy that comes up with the scenario for it because it's a torture test for our incident response plan. But you'll find a lot of that builds those lines of communication, gets all those parties responsible together and gets that rapport built between them so that in the event of an actual incident, everything moves like a well-oiled machine and you can get a handle on the incident, stop the bleeding, and get to the response process or the resolution process a lot faster.
Yeah, I like to think of those tabletops as your practice for the big game, right? And Mike, are there resources out there? I mean, if somebody's never run a tabletop before, maybe they don't understand what it is. But is there a place you can turn to find tabletops that maybe you could download and walk through? Or
certainly there is. In fact, thank you for the segue. The PTAC actually provides some downloadable tabletop data breach response training kits, and they are prepackaged scenarios that include a facilitator guide that will allow you to set up a tabletop exercise in your organization. You substitute your plan into the process and you present it and unfolds over time. It's designed for about a hour and a half, 2 hour thing, and we have several available. We've got I think 3 or 4 now that are available for download from our website at studentprivacy.ed.gov. Just type in data breach response training kit into the search bar and it will take you right to them.
Yeah, and one of the easiest ones I've seen school districts do is it's called Computer Snow Day. And you basically pretend that your computer doesn't work and you keep a notepad next to you and you write down all the things that, like, I needed my computer for this, I needed my computer for that. So in the event of a cyber outage or any kind of outage, really, you can find ways to keep your school district running. Think about attendance alone. How are we going to take attendance if the system's offline? Most that's automated for everybody these days. How are we going to track students coming and going? So you need to think about not just mitigating the incident, but also how are we going to keep the wheels turning while the school district is going? Because it's basically, there's, depending on your school district, median size in Wisconsin is around 700. It's a lot of little friends to make sure we all get to the right places at the right time and get on the bus and go home safe and sound. Let's talk a little bit in the incident response piece about how do the vendors play into this, Mike? I mean, how do we get them to be stakeholders in what's happening and work with them during an incident?
So first of all, I love that Computer Snow Day thing. That's incredible. I love that because that's something that people often don't realize until after the computer's not available, what they need it for.
That's copyrighted. You can steal that if you want.
Excellent. So with regard to vendors, absolutely. As schools are outsourcing more and more of their things that they would otherwise be doing in their own enterprise to these third-party providers, it becomes really imperative to understand first what security controls and what response capabilities those vendors have. And so while you're doing the dance with the vendor to try to understand what services they provide and what kind of benefits you'll get as an organization, it behooves the organization to ask about this component specifically. and establish that point of contact. Understand what their response process is and kind of do that crosswalk with your own to build those lines of communication. So if we have a vendor that gets hacked, for example, they know to call our point of contact and let us know. They shouldn't wait for the news to come out. The last thing a school would want is to find out that their vendor was breached by a news story. The vendor should be contacting them and let them know. And understanding that their written agreements with those vendors are the enforcement mechanisms that they use, that they as a school can use to make sure that these things are followed, because that's your control as a school or a district to sort of lay the groundwork for how you're going to interact with your vendor, especially in the case of a breach or a data security incident.
Well, this has been a really great conversation, and I feel like we maybe tricked our listeners a little bit by saying top 5 things, and then every one of our main bullet points has about 5 subsections to it. So there might be a little sense of overwhelmness right now. People saying, well, that's a lot, and admittedly it is. There's a lot of work that has to go into making sure that students' data is safe and that we are cyber protected. And we're really, I would almost say it's a little bit of the Wild Wild West. We're on the edge of something new here, and hopefully this gets easier and simpler as time goes on. But right now, this is what we have to work with. So thinking about the topics that we just talked about, Mike, some words of encouragement, and I always like to say, how do you eat a whale, and one bite at a time. So you want to maybe just kind of, echo or talk about how student districts can get started, and some words of motivation.
Sure. The good news is it is always overwhelming, and the truth is that almost everybody who listens to this event is going to be doing a lot of these things to one degree or another. And so the 5 things are really just focus areas. If you can pick 1 or 2 things out of each of those, you're moving in the right direction. And little steps over time build momentum, and eventually you'll find yourself way ahead of the game. That adage of when it comes to survival, you don't have to be the fastest zebra, just not the slowest. So every small incremental step you make moves you further up that pack of zebras. So when the lions are hungry, they'll go after somebody else, and that is your goal as a cybersecurity practitioner. Is you realize secure doesn't exist. There's no possible way to reduce or to eliminate the risk, and so it's about acceptability. And what you can do as an organization is resign yourself to make steps where you can. And there's a lot of folks on the ride with you. We here at PTAC, we are 100% with you. If you have any questions or need technical assistance, we're in the same boat with you. We'll help bail. We can give you resources. We can connect dots. So don't feel like you're in this alone.
I really appreciate that, and those are good words. And again, I want to thank you for being here today, Mike. And I want to give you just your final thoughts. I'm gonna give you the last word, and then after you're done, we're gonna just let the users know where they can find this in the future. So again, Mike, thanks for hitting all this. My biggest takeaway here is that it takes everyone to get this moving forward, and it's everyone's lift. And I really like the first piece that we talked about is about making it important and really carving out something that's incredibly hard for educators right now is time, and making sure that we have that precious resource of time. So Mike, final thoughts?
I just want to say thank you so much, Ed, and to everyone there in Wisconsin. We hope everything is wonderful for you, and want to remind everybody that cyber is an ongoing everyday thing, and thanks again for the opportunity to speak with you.
Great. Well, it's so great to have you here. So those of you who are listening now and in the future, again, hi to the future people, this will be posted on the DPI cybersecurity website. We will have it up there in about a week. We have to have it go through a process to get closed caption, and we will listen to it for all the different resources that we've talked about here today with Mike, and make sure that those are up there, and any other resources that we may not have on our website at this point in time. I want to thank Rachel Schemling, who is producing this podcast and webinar right at the moment. She's in the background right here with us, and she's doing a great job of making sure this looks really professional and nice. And I really want to thank Mike for being here today, and it's really super nice to have him here and taking time from Washington, D.C. to come over here and virtually talk to us. So again, thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we look forward to our next webinar and talking to you soon.